Hey crew, I think it's time that we had a lesson on aluminium corrosion issues. Let's have a chat about the different types of corrosion that an aluminium sailboat or any boat suffers, especially in seawater or salty water. From my research to make this video, I've learned a hell of a lot. And it's probably stuff that I should have known some time ago. If I had known that, I could have minimized the corrosion issues that I have now. The thing is, I had the impression that it was just some bubbling paint and that there was nothing actually happening or going wrong with the aluminium. It was just lifting paint, and I'm wrong about that. As I've removed the paint and seen under the bubbles, I can see that the aluminium is being pitted. Now this is on the deck area. This is not on the hull at all. There is some corrosion in the bilges, and we're going to go through that and how that happened and how to avoid that. But again, it's not very bad. It's just a little bit of pitting. Now my biggest issue is the deck areas that are bubbling, and they have to be rectified. But we're going to discuss how this corrosion occurs and how we can prevent it from happening in the future. So let's start with the galvanic table. A couple hundred years ago, Luigi Galvani discovered that if you put two different metals together in an electrolyte, there is a voltage created between them. What's an electrolyte? Well, typically it's a liquid, but can be a paste, something that is in liquid form and can carry an electrical current. Salt water, basically. What do you drink when you're dehydrated? You drink salt water, electrolytes. The function of an electrolyte is to carry electrical charge, and in this case, between two different metals or dissimilar metals. Now from this chart you can see, which is a list of different metals showing their relative voltages. Let's start with magnesium up the top. You can see that it sits at about a minus 1.6 volts. Down the bottom is graphite and sitting around about the plus 0.3 volts. That's a difference of almost 2 volts. If you were to put those two metals in some seawater, put a multimeter over the two of those, you're going to get about 2 volts. That's almost a battery. Now the bottom of the screen, the graphite, you see it says most noble, and the magnesium is showing least noble. What happens is magnesium gives up electrons to the graphite in this instance, and that means the magnesium will decay. It will corrode. Now something less extreme but still relevant to boats, if we look at stainless steel grade 316, which is used for marine, it sits around about minus 0.1, 0.2 volts. So if we use a stainless steel 316 nut or bolt or screw in an aluminium alloy, which sits around a minus 8 to minus 1, that's a difference of about 0.6 to 0.8 volts. Again, the aluminium is less noble, and it is going to give up electrons to the stainless steel. The aluminium will decay. It will corrode. All right, so how do we avoid this happening to our aluminium boat? What we want to do is use anodes. Anodes are less noble. When we talk about boat anodes, we're talking about less noble metals than aluminium. And you can see the ones that are less noble is beryllium, zinc, magnesium. Now, if we were to attach these metals to the boat in the electrolyte underwater, they would corrode before the aluminium, because there will be a current formed between the aluminium and the anodes. So let's have a look at these. Why don't we use beryllium? Because apparently it's very toxic and we don't want to touch it, don't want to go near it. We use zinc and we use magnesium. We also use a different grade of aluminium. Boat or marine grade aluminium is the 6000 or the 5000 series in the range of aluminium alloys. there is an alloy called indium aluminium, and that is less noble than marine grade alloy. So aluminium anodes are becoming more popular. Zinc is still used, but it's a little toxic, and it's not so great to put into the environment or the ocean. However, zinc is still widely used. Why wouldn't we use magnesium? It's even better at giving up electrons. Wouldn't it be a better anode? No. Why? Because it won't last very long. It's too fast. It'll decay too quickly. I am generally replacing zinc anodes about once a year in certain areas on the boat. Magnesium, you'd probably have to replace it every month. The other problem with magnesium, because of the overactivity, is that there's a lot of hydrogen produced, and that can affect the aluminium. It's known as hydrogen embrittlement, and that's why you don't want to use magnesium. You can use magnesium anodes in fresh water because the activity is 5 times less in fresh water. So you can use magnesium in that case, but definitely not in seawater. Now, the ABYC recommends a protection of 200 millivolts or 0.2 volts between the aluminium and the anode. So we can see that the zinc falls into that category nicely. The magnesium, too much. As mentioned, bad things can happen. So the zincs or the indium aluminium anodes are the go. Let's discuss the different types of corrosion which affect a boat on the ocean. And this is anywhere from a fishing dinghy or an ocean liner. They're going to have the same types of corrosion. Aeroplane structures or other structures will have their own unique set of circumstances and environment. So let's focus just on what's going to affect your boat. Having just mentioned the galvanic table, we can see that if two dissimilar metals are immersed in electrolyte, seawater, and that's not necessarily under the waterline, that can be on the deck too, because you're going to get splash, you're going to get spray everywhere. In the bottom 500 to 1,000 feet of the atmosphere over the ocean is just a huge amount of salt in the air. So it doesn't matter if you're not even wet, you have moisture which is salt laden. Two different metals in an electrolyte like the seawater have to be separated if possible. This is most important when you're using stainless steel fasteners. The aluminium is going to lose. So you need to separate those metals somehow. Now, people talk about using plastic washers, and that's fine if you're able to separate with a plastic washer, but a washer really only separates the bolt head. The bolt itself still goes into the aluminium. So what you need to use for those sort of fasteners is a good coating of Tef gel or Lanacoat. Tef gel is like 40% Teflon, so it's a plastic coating which will stay between the aluminium and the stainless steel and protect against voltages. It'll also help keep the water out of the threads. So coating like that is the best that we can do in a fastener situation. There's also dissimilar metals under the water. I've got an aluminium hull, and I've got stainless steel prop shafts, and I've got brass propellers. I use zincs, the round ones, that on the prop shaft, and they are the ones that are regularly replaced because there's a lot of galvanic action in that area. 3 different metals all in the same area. So there's a lot of currents moving around there. So you want those currents to come from the anode, the zinc itself. I usually replace my prop shaft anodes between 6 and 12 months. The next form of corrosion is called stray current corrosion. And that is due to a fault or an imperfection in the wiring of my boat, where a voltage is present from the wiring somehow. Aluminium boats or metal boats, it's more ideal to have a floating earth system where, unlike a car, you do not use the negative pole of the battery onto the chassis, onto the hull. You do not do that. Ideally, you want to keep it floating earth, which means 2 core connectors to every electrical appliance. Jupiter is not. It's takes a little effort and expense to float your earth. The biggest culprit is the engine. If you buy a normal marine engine, it is not floating earth. You would have to change out the starter motor, the alternator, the temperature sensors, the oil pressure sensors, because they're all single pole. They just have one lug, positive, and then they use the engine block as a negative. Now, what I've done to minimize the current flowing through the engine and into the hull, because the engine is definitely grounded to the hull just by the mounting bolts, I have a big master battery switch which I can turn off both negative and the positive poles to the engine. So when I'm not using the engine, when I'm sailing or when I'm sitting in the marina, I can turn off the connection to the engine. So everything is isolated from the engine. But there are still leaks which make the boat not a perfectly floating earth. One culprit can be the VHF antenna. On a VHF antenna, the coaxial cable is attached, the outside, the braiding, the shielding is attached to the antenna base. Any sort of radio needs a ground plane, so the actual VHF unit needs a ground, so it's using the boat as a ground. So there is pretty hard to keep a floating earth on a metal boat, but you should strive to minimize the voltages there. Otherwise, stray current ends up in the water and hopefully will eat your anodes before the boat. So again, must have anodes on your metal boat. The biggest culprit for stray current is usually from someone else's boat. We were sitting in Hout Bay, South Africa, for 2 or 3 months, and about 3 boats away was a steel boat. Now, a mild steel boat with all its metal hanging in the water is more noble than aluminium. We found our anodes were decaying pretty fast in this marina, and it's probably because of that metal boat 3 boats away, but it can also be from the marina itself. There can be other metals in the water from the walkways, the piles. There's lots of currents in a marina. It's one reason that you should avoid swimming in there, because you can get electrocuted. So, stray current corrosion is from electricity from your boat or from someone else's boat or marina eating away at your boat. Keep your anodes up and you shouldn't have a problem there. All right. The last type of corrosion that I want to talk about is called crevice corrosion, and it is basically moisture finding its way into a crevice or a crack, or in my case, the biggest issue is the moisture getting under the paint. Where there's an edge of paint, moisture can get under, especially it's salt water moisture. It starts to corrode there, starts building up a hydroxide, the white powder. The chemical reaction that's happening there is quite destructive, and it spreads and grows. My boat's 10 years old, and as you'll see, there's some significant cancer growing under that paint, which finally I'm addressing. Now, there's a great YouTube video which I've learned a lot from by TD Burley. He's a small YouTuber. He's only got 4 videos, but one of them is about corrosion of aluminium alloys, and it is excellent. It's only about 6 minutes long. I would love to get in contact with him and ask permission for this video, but he's got no form of contact here on YouTube. If he happens to see this video, I beg him, please allow this to educate other aluminium boat users. So thank you very much, TD Burley, but I'm going to use a little bit of your stuff. Let me know if it's a problem. All right, let's have a look at some of this video.
This is a part from an aircraft. As you can see, is that these are the bolt holes, the rivet holes, which hold the parts together. If we flip it over, we'll notice that some of these on the outside surface are showing very high amount of crevice corrosion, some filiform corrosion going into the paint. These 2 holes are fine, but these 2 are showing corrosion. This aluminum sheet here shows examples of filiform corrosion. It's also known as worm track corrosion. You can see the small little filaments going across the surface. This sheet here shows exfoliation corrosion. This was in ground contact. The ground was very salty. You can see how the corrosion went up between the grains. There's a very flat grains and caused a kind of exfoliation or leafing out. And this spoke right here in the very middle pulled out due to fatigue. So we had an example of galvanic corrosion with the rim, and then also corrosion fatigue causes failure. This aluminum plate was used as a heat sink for electronic equipment. Cooling water flowed through it. As we can see, the cutout side, this side here, is that everywhere the water hit turbulence, it became very turbulent, especially these elbows, we had a whole lot of metal loss. This is called erosion corrosion. Here's an example of cavitation corrosion of a impeller, aluminum impeller, inside an automotive cooling system. This aluminum measuring cup from my kitchen shows examples of pitting corrosion. Look at it up close, we can see there's some pits have perforated completely through the aluminum. The reason that aluminum corrodes is because when aluminum reacts with water, there's a huge amount of energy is released. The delta G for this reaction is 1.1 megajoules per mole. And this is a huge amount of energy for a chemical reaction. So the question comes not why does aluminum corrode, but why does aluminum not corrode? The reason aluminum does not corrode is between the water and the aluminum forms a very thin passive film of aluminum oxide. This is only about 3 nanometers thick. Now, this thin film can break down under certain conditions, and the certain conditions are if there's also oxygen and also salt in the water, and there's defects in the film. Now, if those conditions are met, the aluminum can dissolve away as aluminum plus 3. The aluminum loses those 3 electrons. The 3 electrons go off someplace else, and they find another defect so they can pass through the film, and they combine with the water and the oxygen, and they form hydroxyls. The aluminum, meanwhile, reacts with water that forms aluminum oxide, and it also forms H pluses. These H pluses collect in an area occluded cell, and they attract the chlorides, the sodium chloride, and we form a dilute hydrochloric acid, which continues dissolving away the aluminum metal. Now, the aluminum which is released reacts with the water outside the pit, and it forms a chimney of aluminum hydroxide. The pit becomes so acidic that we can start having hydrogen reduction or hydrogen evolution, and hydrogen bubbles start bubbling up out of the pit. So we have the H2 form. Next, we're going to examine our sample underneath a digital optical microscope. As we increase the magnification on this sample of polished and etched aluminum, we can begin to see the defects where corrosion initiates. They're the black voids, and then the gray dendrites, and this dark second phase particles. We're going to put our corroded aluminum sample into an electron microscope and get a higher magnification images of the corroded surface. In the electron microscope, the white corrosion product on the surface of the corroded aluminum now develops certain features. We can see that now there are mounds and tubes and chimneys poking off at the surface. And these are the chimneys we described earlier, where the hydrogen bubbles pump the aluminum out, and they react with the water to form aluminum hydroxide. This mound here looks like a perfect smokestack. It's such a straight chimney. And off to the side of it, we can see the little cubic salt crystals. Now, if we clean the sample with nitric acid, we can remove this white corrosion product, and there we see the pits beneath each of the chimneys. And inside the pits, we can actually see the second phase particles, which are lit up here in this image.
Hey guys, well thanks for sticking with us through that video. That's a lot of technical stuff, but really those are the main corrosion issues facing aluminium boats. So now that we're armed with that knowledge, there'll be several more videos showing the corrosion that we've got on Jupiter and how we're going to correct it, and probably could have prevented it in the first place. So this compartment is wet a lot.